The slap landed louder than the clink of crystal. For a split second, the entire room forgot how to breathe. Destiny's hand was still suspended in the air, trembling, her chest rising fast beneath her waitress uniform. A single drop of spilled wine slid down the man's cheek, right over the red dragon ink curling along his jawline. Only then did she notice the silence. 12 men in identical black suits stood frozen, their eyes locked on her like she had just signed her own death sentence. The man she had just slapped wasn't just a customer. He was Do Hyun, the man every whisper in the city feared. He turned his head slowly. His expression didn't explode into rage. That was worse. His gaze was calm, cold, and calculating. Destiny's breath caught. She had mistaken him for a rude guest, not the dragon of soul. She didn't know it yet, but this moment of defiance would shatter his stone-cold world. By the time the sun rose the next morning, everything she knew about fear would be rewritten. Lagos was never truly quiet, yet inside the walls of her marriage, Destiny lived in a vacuum. Outside, the city screamed with the sounds of yellow Danfo buses, the scent of roasting corn, and the relentless energy of millions. But inside her home, the air was thick with a silence that felt like a physical weight. Her husband was a man of high standing, a blessing to the family who knew exactly how to perform for the world. He smiled at the right people and spoke with a polished grace that made everyone envy her. But once the front door clicked shut, the performance ended, and the erasure began. He didn't use his hands to hurt her. He was far too calculated for that. Instead, he used a cold, surgical indifference that left no scars but broke everything inside. When Destiny spoke about her day or her dreams for her fashion work, he would look right through her as if she were made of glass. If she reached for a moment of connection, he would simply leave the room, leaving her words to hang in the empty air. It was a slow, intentional dismantling of her spirit. For 3 years, Destiny learned to walk softly, to need less, and to make herself so small that she almost disappeared into the shadows of the house. The turning point didn't come with a shout, but with the realization that she was dying while still breathing. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The vibrant, creative soul she used to be had been replaced by a ghost. One humid afternoon, while her husband was away being the man the world loved, Destiny finally chose herself. She packed 2 suitcases with the remnants of her life and walked out, leaving the hollow prestige of that house behind forever. She ended up on the floor of her sister Adesua's spare bedroom in Enugu, her body shaking with the delayed shock of her own courage. As the ceiling fan whirled overhead, cutting through the heavy heat, Destiny whispered a vow into the dark that would become the foundation of her new life. Never again, she prayed, her voice cracking but firm, will I wait for a man to choose me. She would build a world where she was the sun, not a moon waiting for reflected light. Lagos had taught her how to survive silence. Now, she was ready to go somewhere that would finally hear her voice. The air in the private dining room was thick with the scent of expensive whiskey and the hushed, heavy energy of men who moved the world from the shadows. Destiny moved through the space like a ghost, her uniform a stark black and white contrast against the deep burgundy tones of the club. She had lived in Seoul for months, learning to navigate the city's cold indifference by being faster, quieter, and more efficient than anyone else. Tonight was a high-stakes event, and her only goal was to remain invisible, to finish the shift, and to return to the safety of her quiet apartment. Do Hyun sat at the center of the marble table, a figure of stillness amidst the low flicker of gold candlesticks. He didn't look like a man who needed to raise his voice. The red dragon ink curling along his jawline told the story of his power better than words ever could. Destiny was moving toward his end of the table, her tray balanced with the precision of a woman who had built herself from nothing. She was focused on the rhythm of the room, but the floor, polished to a mirror shine, was treacherous. It happened in a heartbeat. A stray foot, a slick patch of floor, or perhaps just a moment where the universe decided to break the silence. Destiny's balance shifted. The tray tilted, and a glass of deep red wine began its slow-motion descent toward the man at the center of the room. The liquid splashed across Do-hyun's expensive suit, a blooming stain that looked like a fresh wound. The room went deathly silent. 12 pairs of eyes locked onto her, and for the first time in years, the invisible waitress was the only thing anyone could see. The manager's face drained of color as he began to move toward her, his hand raised in a frantic, unthinking reflex to manage the mistake before the dragon could react. But Destiny's survival instincts, forged in the hard rooms of Lagos, moved faster than her fear. As the manager reached out to grab her, to shove her away from the table, Destiny didn't shrink. She didn't disappear. Instead, her hand flew up in a sharp, defensive arc. The slap landed with a crack that echoed louder than the clink of crystal, her palm connecting with the manager's face in a desperate bid for her own space. Only as the sound faded did she realize the true horror of the scene. She wasn't just standing over a spilled drink. She was standing in the center of a storm, having disrupted the order of the most dangerous room in Seoul. She looked at Do-hyun, expecting the rage of a kingpin, but found only a cold, unreadable gaze that seemed to be memorizing the soul of the woman who had dared to strike back. The morning after the accident brought a silence that felt different from the one Destiny had left behind in Lagos. That old silence was a hollow, soul-crushing weight, but this was a thick, electric tension that made the very air in her small Itaewon apartment feel heavy. She sat by her window, watching the sunrise bleed over the Seoul skyline, expecting a phone call from the restaurant manager telling her she was fired, or worse, a knock from the police. In the world of men like Do-hyun, a waitress didn't just spill wine on a tailored suit and strike a superior without facing a devastating cost. She spent the early hours preparing for the end, wondering if her bank balance was enough for a ticket back to Nigeria, her eyes lingering on the 2 suitcases she had never fully unpacked. But as the clock moved past 9, the dramatic retaliation she expected didn't come. Instead, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb outside her building. Destiny stood behind her curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched as a single man stepped out, not a group of enforcers, but Do-hyun himself. He was alone, his dark jacket buttoned up, looking less like a kingpin and more like a man burdened by a secret. When the knock finally came, Destiny opened the door with the same defiance she had shown in the dining room. She wouldn't grovel or beg. But Do-hyun didn't look angry. He stood in her hallway, stripped of the gold candlelight and the wall of suited men, and for a moment, he looked almost human. He didn't mention the ruined suit or the slap. Instead, he looked at her modest apartment, his eyes lingering on a small fashion sketch she had pinned to the wall. "You are the only person in that room who wasn't acting," he said, his voice a low hum that vibrated in the small space. He didn't offer an apology, but he didn't offer a threat either. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, elegant card on her table, not a summons, but a private invitation to a textile gallery. Most people fear the dragon because of what it can do. You looked at it and saw a man who needed to be told no. As he turned to leave, Destiny realized the shock the morning had promised wasn't a punishment. It was the realization that by refusing to be invisible, she had accidentally invited the most dangerous man in Seoul to truly see her. The silence was finally broken, but as she looked at the card, she knew the noise that was coming would change her life forever. The textile gallery was a cathedral of light and silence, a far cry from the smoky, pressurized air of the private club. Destiny stood before a bolt of hand-dyed indigo silk, her fingers hovering just inches from the fabric. She felt a presence behind her before she heard it, a shift in the room's temperature that she had already begun to associate with him. Do-hyun didn't stand over her. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the same deep blue threads. In the weeks that followed his visit to her apartment, the man who moved through Seoul like a storm became a constant, quiet shadow in her life. Their romance didn't bloom with grand gestures or loud declarations. It grew in the spaces between words, in the way he would appear at her favorite coffee shop just as she was finishing a sketch, or how he sat in silence while she explained the cultural significance of a Nigerian pattern. For the first time, Destiny found a man who didn't try to fill the room with his own ego. Do-hyun listened with an intensity that made her feel more than just seen. It made her feel significant. Yet, the shadow of his world was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of his polished suits. He would take her to dinner at places where the staff bowed too low and the other patrons looked away too quickly. She noticed the way his eyes never stopped scanning the room, the way his phone would buzz with messages he never answered in her presence, and the way a wall of suited men always seemed to materialize whenever they stepped out onto the street. He was a man of two worlds, the one where he looked at her with a raw, almost desperate tenderness, and the one where he commanded a legion of ghosts. Destiny tried to keep her own world separate, clinging to her small apartment and her freelance work, afraid that leaning too hard on him would mean losing herself again. But the gravity of his care was difficult to resist. He noticed the small things, the way she missed the spice of home, the way her shoulders tensed when she was tired, and he addressed them without making her feel like a project to be managed. One evening, as they walked along the Han River, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes, he took her hand. His skin was warm, and for a moment, the dangerous ink on his neck seemed like nothing more than a memory. Destiny realized she was falling for a man who lived in the dark, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the shadows he cast. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be the light that finally made them stay still. The secret arrived not with a shout, but with a quiet, persistent change in the way Destiny's body moved through the world. It was a morning in late spring when the realization finally settled, a soft hum of life that made the bustling streets of Seoul feel suddenly distant and small. She was pregnant. For a few days, she kept the news in the hollow of her heart, afraid that speaking it aloud would shatter the fragile peace she had found in the dragon's shadow. She was a woman who had learned to expect nothing, yet here was everything, growing quietly inside her. When she finally told Do-hyun, she expected the mask of the boss to slide back into place, cold and calculating. Instead, she watched a flicker of something raw and terrifyingly vulnerable cross his face. He didn't speak at first. He simply reached out and placed his hand over hers, his fingers trembling slightly against her skin. In that moment, the dangerous man who commanded the city disappeared, replaced by a man who looked like he had just been given the sun. As her bump began to show, the world around them shifted. Do-hyun's care turned into a fierce, quiet protection. He no longer took her to crowded clubs. Instead, he brought the world to her. But with the joy came a new kind of weight. He insisted she wear a dress he had commissioned specifically for a high-level dinner where he would finally introduce her to his inner circle as his partner. The dress arrived in a box that smelled of cedar and expensive silk. It was a deep, rich burgundy velvet, the color of vintage wine and royal blood. When Destiny slipped it on, the fabric hugged her full, pregnant figure with a maternal grace she hadn't known she possessed. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was no longer invisible, no longer a waitress hiding in the margins of a foreign city. She was elegant, chosen, and visibly carrying the future of a man who had never believed in one. As she smoothed the velvet over her stomach, her hand resting protectively over the life inside, she felt a surge of pride. She was going to walk into a room full of the most dangerous men in Korea, not as a servant, but as a queen. She didn't know that the burgundy dress was destined to become a battlefield, or that the elegance she felt in that moment would soon be tested by a cruelty she thought she had left behind in the shadows of Lagos. For now, she simply breathed in the scent of the silk, feeling safe in the belief that this time, she was truly cherished. The air in the private dining hall was thick with the scent of lilies and the cold, sharp edge of expensive cologne. Destiny sat at the head of the marble table, the deep burgundy velvet of her dress catching the low light of the gold candlesticks. She felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes, men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of looking through people, but she held her head high. Her left hand rested instinctively over her bump, a silent promise of protection to the life within. Do-hyun sat beside her, his presence a wall of granite, his hand resting flat on the table in a display of terrifying stillness. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mi-cha entered not with a shout, but with a predatory grace that made the enforcers shift in their seats. She was draped in black satin, her eyes like shards of glass as they landed on Destiny. To Mi-cha, Destiny was an intruder, a nameless girl from a world that didn't belong in their shadows. She walked straight to the head of the table, ignoring the warning silence that filled the room. "You really thought a dress could make you one of us?" Mi-cha's voice was a poisonous whisper that cut through the ceremony. She didn't wait for an answer. With a sudden, violent motion, she leaned across the table. The slap was a sharp, cracking sound that shattered the evening. Destiny's head snapped to the side, the sting blossoming across her cheek like fire. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional shock that followed. Destiny didn't cry out. She froze, her hand tightening over her stomach as she waited for the world to explode. She waited for Do-hyun to rise, to roar, to strike back as he had promised he always would. 1 second passed. The wall of suited men held their breath. 2 seconds passed. Mi-cha stood her ground, her face a mask of cold triumph, her eyes locked on Do-hyun. 3 seconds passed. Do-hyun remained perfectly still. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the space between them, his fingers unmoving on the marble. He was calculating the politics, the power, and the fallout, but in those 3 seconds of hesitation, he had forgotten the woman sitting next to him. Destiny didn't wait for the 4th second. The silence of the room was suddenly identical to the silence of Lagos, and she realized that a man who calculates his protection is a man who has already failed to provide it. She reached out, unfastened the gold wedding ring from her finger, and placed it on the cold stone. Without a word, she stood up, her velvet dress rustling in the graveyard quiet, and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back at the dragon. She was too busy choosing herself. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, but the sound was muffled by the ringing in Destiny's ears. Every step she took away from the dining hall felt like she was shedding a layer of a life that had never truly fit. The cool night air of Seoul hit her face, a sharp contrast to the stinging heat on her cheek where Mi-cha's palm had landed. She didn't call for one of Do-hyun's drivers. She didn't want to be carried by his power anymore. Instead, she walked toward the subway, her burgundy velvet dress trailing slightly against the pavement, a queen walking away from a throne that had turned to ash. Back at the table, the gold wedding ring sat alone on the white marble. It looked small and insignificant against the vast expanse of the stone, a tiny circle of gold that had once represented a promise of safety. Do-hyun finally moved, his hand reaching out to touch the metal, his fingers hovering just inches away. The 12 men in the room remained frozen, watching the dragon stare at the one thing his strength couldn't hold on to. He had waited 3 seconds to act, but in the world of a woman like Destiny, 3 seconds was a lifetime of abandonment. Destiny didn't go to the penthouse they shared. She took the train to a small, quiet street in Itaewon, stopping before a door she had kept the key to even when Do-hyun begged her to let it go. It was her independent apartment, a modest space she had paid for with her own hard-earned money from her days as a waitress. As she stepped inside, the scent of her own familiar perfume and the sight of her unfinished fashion sketches greeted her. She walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, staring at the red mark on her skin. It was a brand of shame that Mi-cha had intended for her, but as Destiny looked at her reflection, she saw something else. She saw the woman from Lagos who had survived silence before. She saw a mother who had just taught her unborn child that dignity is not up for negotiation. She spent the night on the floor of her living room, her back against the sofa, her hand resting over her bump. She didn't cry. The time for tears had ended in the dining hall. She was back where she started, in a small room with nothing but her own 2 hands and a heart that was no longer waiting to be defended. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy with the shadow of the dragon. It felt like her own. Destiny closed her eyes, listening to the quiet rhythm of her own breath, knowing that while she was alone, she was finally, undeniably free. The silence that followed Destiny's departure was not empty. It was a storm held behind a dam. For the first hour, Do-hyun did not move from the marble table. He stared at the gold ring, its steady glimmer a mocking reminder of the 3 seconds he had spent thinking like a boss instead of a man. When he finally rose, the 12 men in the room stood with him, but he didn't look at them. He looked at Mi-cha, who was still wearing her cold smile of victory. At that moment, Do-hyun didn't shout. He simply spoke 2 words that began the erasure. She's gone.
He didn't mean Destiny.
He meant the world Mi-cha inhabited. Over the next 72 hours, Do-hyun moved with a surgical, terrifying precision. He didn't use violence. He used the very thing Destiny had fled from: absolute, total erasure. By the second morning, Mi-cha's bank accounts were ghosts. The luxury apartment that had been her fortress was reclaimed by a holding company that no longer recognized her name. The social circles that fed her ego closed their doors, acting as if she had never existed. He dismantled her life brick by brick, proving that the power she used to strike Destiny was a gift he could take back at any moment. But while he erased the enemy, he spent the rest of his energy trying to bridge the distance he had created. He knew Destiny wouldn't answer his calls. He knew she wouldn't open her door to his enforcers. So, he reached across the world to the only person who could speak through her silence. In her small Itaewon apartment, Destiny sat on her floor, her back against the wall, watching the rain streak against the glass. The third morning brought a knock that didn't sound like a heavy-handed guard or a desperate lover. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping she recognized from a lifetime ago. When she opened the door, her breath hitched. Standing there, clutching a worn travel bag and looking exhausted from a 20-hour flight, was her sister, Bora. "He sent for me," Bora whispered, her eyes filling with tears as she pulled Destiny into a hug that smelled of home and Nigerian spices. "He said you were in a room full of shadows and that you needed someone who knew your real name." Destiny wept then, the first tears she had shed since the dinner. She realized that while Do-hyun had spent 72 hours destroying the woman who hurt her, he had spent those same hours finally learning how to listen to the silence. He hadn't sent flowers or jewelry. He had sent her the only piece of herself he couldn't provide. As she held her sister, Destiny realized the erasure was complete, not just of her enemy, but of the wall Do-hyun had built around his own heart. The knock at the door on the 4th evening was different from the others. It wasn't the frantic rhythm of the manager or the familiar comfort of Bora's touch. It was a single, heavy thud followed by a long silence, as if the person on the other side was bracing themselves for a final verdict. Destiny stood in the center of her small living room, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. She felt the life inside her kick, a small, rhythmic reminder of why she had walked away from the dragon's gold. When she opened the door, Do-hyun was standing there, looking like a man who had spent 72 hours at war with himself. He didn't try to step inside. He didn't use his presence to overwhelm the small hallway. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. His hand shook slightly as he held it out to her. His gaze dropped to the floor as if he no longer felt worthy of looking into the eyes he had failed to defend. "Everything is in there," he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves on pavement. Destiny took the envelope, the weight of the paper surprisingly heavy in her hands. As she pulled the contents out, her breath caught. These weren't apologies or empty promises written on silk. They were legal documents, actual binding freedom. One paper was the deed to the apartment they were standing in, fully paid for and placed solely in her name. Another was a legal agreement giving her full and absolute custody of their unborn child, signed and notarized by the highest authorities in the city. The final document was a full transfer of his legal business assets into a trust that she controlled. By handing over these papers, Do-hyun had dismantled every piece of leverage he had over her. He had given her the wealth to live without him, the home to hide from him, and the legal power to keep their daughter away from his shadows forever. "I didn't come to take you back," Do-hyun said, finally looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "I came to give you the choice. You told me once that you never wanted to wait for a man to choose you again. So, I am putting all the power in your hands. If you walk away now, you go with everything. You owe me nothing." Destiny looked from the documents to the man who had spent his life accumulating control, only to surrender it all to the woman he had almost lost to silence. For the first time since the night of the slap, the air felt clear. He wasn't trying to manage her. He was finally respecting her. She realized then that the most dangerous thing a dragon could do wasn't to fight. It was to surrender. The choice was finally hers, and for the first time in her life, the answer didn't come from fear, but from the quiet, powerful beat of her own heart. The transition from the world of shadows to the light of a new life didn't happen overnight, but it began the moment Destiny decided that her heart was a place worth protecting. Months passed, and the heavy, velvet-draped tension of their past was replaced by the bright, clean air of a home built on truth rather than power. Do-hyun had kept his word. He had stepped back, transforming his vast, dark networks into legitimate trade corridors, proving that he could build something beautiful without the use of fear. He no longer arrived with a wall of suited men. He arrived with groceries, with books on architecture, and with a quiet humility that spoke louder than any dragon's roar. When the day finally arrived, the hospital room in Seoul was filled with a peace that Destiny had once thought impossible. There were no calculated silences or high-stakes introductions. There was only the rhythmic hum of the monitors and the steady, grounding presence of Bora holding her hand. When the first cry of their daughter finally broke the quiet, it wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration. It was the sound of a legacy of pain ending and a legacy of love beginning. They named her Zoe, a name that meant life, but in the quiet moments when the city lights flickered outside, they called her Haun, a name for a girl who was a gift of grace. As Do-hyun held the tiny, fragile bundle for the first time, his large, tattooed hands trembling beneath her weight, the transformation was complete. He looked down at the daughter, who carried the strength of Lagos and the resilience of Seoul in her veins, and he wept, not for the power he had lost, but for the soul he had finally found. Destiny watched them from the bed, her heart full and her spirit finally at rest. She looked at her daughter and knew that Zoe would never have to learn how to shrink herself to fit into a room. She would never have to count the seconds of a man's silence to measure her worth. She was the daughter of a woman who had stood in a room full of monsters and chosen herself, and a man who had been brave enough to surrender his kingdom to become a father. As the sun rose on Zoe's first morning, casting a golden glow over the three of them, Destiny realized that her journey hadn't been about escaping the shadows, but about learning that she carried the sun within her all along. The invisible waitress was gone, replaced by a mother, a partner, and a queen. In the soft, breathing silence of the room, Destiny whispered a promise to her sleeping daughter. The world was big, and for the first time, they were both exactly where they belonged. Moral lesson. The story of Destiny and Do-hyun offers several powerful moral lessons about self-worth, the nature of true protection, and the courage required to change. Here are the key moral lessons from the story. Silence is not peace. In her first marriage in Lagos, Destiny learned that a man doesn't have to be physically violent to be abusive. The cold silence, used to make her feel invisible, was a form of control. The story teaches that a healthy relationship requires active presence and communication, not just the absence of conflict. Your worth is non-negotiable. When Destiny walked out of the dinner party after the slap, she proved that no amount of wealth, power, or status is worth being humiliated. By leaving her wedding ring on the table, she showed that her dignity was more valuable than being the wife of the most powerful man in the city. True protection is proactive, not calculated. Do-hyun's 3 seconds of hesitation was his biggest failure. He was calculating the politics and consequences of the situation instead of instinctively protecting the person he loved. The lesson is that true love and protection don't wait for a convenient moment. They act when they are needed most. Power is nothing without accountability. Do-hyun had all the power and soul, but he was losing the only thing that mattered. The story shows that real strength is not found in how many people fear you, but in having the courage to dismantle your own ego and surrender control to do what is right for your family.